Hello and welcome to this week's masterclass. We are with Philip Norman today, who is a public procurement expert and is going to take us through the tried and tested way to win public sector contracts. If you've got any questions, do pop them in the questions box and I'll be sure to ask Philip at the end of the masterclass. So, okay, Philip, if you want to get going.
Yeah, thanks, Lydia. Afternoon, everybody. Well, thanks for dialing into the tried and tested way to win public sector contracts. Obviously, with this being a 30-minute webinar, the level of detail that I can go into is fairly minimal. However, at the end, I'll provide my contact details. So if anybody wanted to speak to me offline, then please don't hesitate in doing so. So to start with then, just a little bit about me, apologies if that picture is too big. I used to work within the government as a public procurement professional, and in 2013 I set up Bid Better, just really to bridge the gap between how companies are trying to sell their services to the public sector, and then obviously with that innate understanding of how public sector bodies are buying goods and services. Since then, as a business, we've helped clients win over £400 million worth of contracts, and we've helped SMEs, really grow and deliver those strategies that they've put in place to grow and expand as businesses. And our focus really is on the SME market, because we recognise that the resource and expertise and knowledge isn't necessarily always there. So to start with then, what are the benefits of winning a contract through a tender process? And really, this can be for any tender process, not only the public sector. But clearly it aids the sustainable growth of the business. If you can win a contract for multiple years, it allows you as a business to grow and grow from a kind of a monetary turnover perspective, but also from a knowledge perspective as well. The public sector are quite a challenging markets, and they will really challenge you to grow in many ways. It's also an avenue for more opportunities. I've seen some really good examples of where where suppliers have won public sector contracts, and the public bodies talk to one another, and if you're delivering and performing for one, and you're achieving your key performance indicators and your success tests, then the chances are that the door will open for other opportunities elsewhere, and they'd know you. It's a good reference point. It also provides you with tried and tested bid content. So there's a lot of repetition in public sector tenders. So if you've got good tried and tested content, and it's tried and tested in the sense that you've been successful, then you can use that, tweaking it for other opportunities. And to win one, it provides a really excellent case study, and it's evidence that you can deliver for public sector organisations. So is now a good time to pursue public contracts? It really is, actually. It's a fantastic time. The government and the previous government have been very supportive of SMEs in terms of setting targets for SMEs to access public contracts, and the current target of £1 in £3 to be spent with SMEs by 2020 is in place and well on course to be achieved. There's 230 billion spent each year on products and services, in various different categories, various different products and services as well. And there's in excess of 10,000 tender opportunities advertised every single month. So singly, that equates to probably the biggest buyer, so the biggest potential customer in the UK. And the process is being standardised. So obviously I can't second guess whether anybody on the webinar has been involved in a contracting process in the past, but things like the pre-qualification stage has been standardised. If you're bidding for one with standard information, you'll be able to use that for a second bid as well. This to me is a really key area, attempting to engage with the buyer pre-tender. It's something that a lot of companies don't necessarily believe they can do or should do. As a business, this really is our kind of USP, if you like. We really help companies position themselves better with public sector bodies. But it is a bit of a minefield, and one that I would love to go into on detail within this webinar. But I've included a link at the end to an ebook that we've developed that really helps potential suppliers engage better with the public sector. So that's all about identifying the most suitable customer or public organisation for your business, and that might be based regionally or very fitting with your product or service. And it just goes through 4 really quite straightforward steps in terms of how to create a better chance for success, and a large part of that is speaking to the public body before the tender actually comes out. The tender, if you like, is very much the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of work that can be done pre-tender. But as I say, I've included a link at the end of the webinar to which that will be shared with you at the end, so you can download that from the website, and it's a good informative ebook. So the first port of call then is identifying tender opportunities and identifying the formal tender opportunities. Loads of people get very confused about which portals they should be using, registering with, whether they should be paying, whether they're free to use. Some companies I see use many various different portals, and it's a bit of a belts and braces approach. And quite frankly, there isn't a right or wrong way of approaching this. So what I'll do, I'll talk to you about how we identify tender opportunities. I'm sure some of you will recognise all of these different opportunities, and quite frankly, there's probably about 20% of all tender opportunity portals listed here. But ultimately, public sector organisations have to advertise their opportunities. And it has to be in an open and fair environment if it reaches certain values. Now, therefore, if you're registered on any of these that you see in front of you, the chances are that you would identify that opportunity, and you would get that opportunity sent to you because you can set up email alerts. But the ones that we use highlighted Contracts Finder, and that's the gov.uk free to use portal. Over the years, being quite candid about it, it's had a fairly bad reputation, but from our experience, it works perfectly well. It's really easy to use, very, very intuitive. And the other one we use is the Pro Contract. Again, pretty easy to use. I wouldn't say as easy as Contracts Finder, but it is easy once you know, but then isn't everything. And also the coverage for Pro Contracts is very, very good. So I would advise you as a first port of call, register on both Contracts Finder and Pro Contract. They both allow you to set up email alerts for your particular product or service or offering. Then as soon as that opportunity or a relevant opportunity becomes live, you will then get notified, so you can set up email alerts for daily, weekly, monthly. I would suggest you do that on a daily basis. So getting to the crux of it then, we'll start with the negative. Why do most bids fail? These are 3 or 4 of the key reasons. The first one being non-compliant. Within every tender, there is certain evaluation criteria, there's certain minimum criteria, and it might in some cases just be a question of putting in a response. We see a number of bids failing for just not meeting that compliance element. And very, very frustrating for businesses and MDs of businesses in particular who invest time and resource into a bid, and then they fail on the compliance elements. So that's number 1. Number 2, there's very much a poor understanding of the requirements and the evaluation criteria. So what that means is every single tender has evaluation criteria. That is how the public body is going to mark your response to give you a scoring to ultimately decide who they're going to award that contract to. A lot of bidders throw in content that they feel is relevant, whereas the relevance should be 100% aligned to the requirement and the evaluation criteria. And that is all very obviously stated within the tender documents. Another key area is being bidder-centric, so very much focusing on you as an organisation, and it's closely linked to point 2 in that the focus isn't really on what the public sector body wants or how it's going to evaluate the contracts. It's very much on how the supplier, how the bidder wants to present that information and what they want to tell them. So, for example, I've seen included in bids really standard marketing material. It's an absolute no-no, and you know, it may sometimes luckily obtain a few marks, but if that's how you're approaching tenders, then that isn't the right approach. The right approach is 100% aligned to the evaluation criteria and what the buyer wants to achieve. The best drafting tips, and there are of course many, but for me, it's all about the structure of the response. If the response isn't easy to evaluate, then the response won't score as many marks. So, and this is the area of correction we have with many of our clients. They have the content and they're passionately develop that content, but when we run through that and do a dummy evaluation for them, it's very difficult for us to pull out the most pertinent parts of that response that are going to be evaluated. So our advice is structure the response as per the question. So within every question, there might be 2 or 3 sub elements to that question. If there are, structure the response exactly as they have structured the question, even including headings, so that you're clearly laying out what the response is, and you're making it very easy for the evaluator to positively evaluate your score. That's what it's all about, getting the evaluator to positively evaluate your score. So what? And that's not me being dismissive here. That is a drafting tip that's really, really useful. We see loads of bids that focus on the features rather than the benefits, and the benefits are what makes the buyers' ears prick up and think, gosh, you know, that can be practically delivered for our public body, and that can deliver so-and-so benefits. So you're really spelling out to them what the feature is and what the benefit of that feature is. So you're leaving nothing unsaid, nothing unstated. And a way of doing that is, if you're unsure whether it's a feature or a benefit, ask yourself the so what question. So if there is a statement, ask yourself so what, and if it isn't clear to you, then it needs a benefit included. I'd like to think this goes without saying, but it doesn't always go without saying for some of the tenders we see, or conversely, some of the tender responses I saw when I was in public procurements. There seems to be a real temptation sometimes to jump into English that presents itself more complexly than perhaps it should do. Why that is, I'm still not sure. But if you're presenting your response in plain, easy to understand English, that is only going to benefit you in terms of its evaluation. The public body doesn't want to kind of second guess what you're trying to say to them because the English isn't as plain as it could be. They just want to read what is clear to them and what answers the question. So I can't stress that enough, and it sounds really simplistic, but plain, easy to understand English. And draft with the evaluator in mind, not with your boss in mind. Now I'll explain that. I see a number of responses that has content that it appears to be very, very credible. However, once you drill into that information or you align it to the evaluation criteria, it's not massively relevant. And you start to see that actually it's all about the response has been developed with the boss in mind. So it's actually trying to impress the boss or trying to second guess what they think the boss or the MD or the sales director might say themselves. Whereas the approach for the tender should all be about the evaluator. And there's a theme coming through here, hopefully. Ultimately, if you're not answering the question, you're not going to score well. If you're not answering the question so that it can be evaluated easily, then your response isn't going to score well. So draft with the evaluator in mind, not with your boss or sales director or managing director or whoever else in mind. It's all 100% about the evaluator. So what's the ultimate objective of a tender response? And I've got this quote, and quite frankly, I've probably stolen this from somebody else, but this for me is really, really fitting, and I use this a lot. It's to win by giving the buyer a solution to their requirements in a way that offers greater value than any other bidder. So I'll read that again. To win by giving the buyer a solution to their requirement in a way that offers greater value than any other bidder. I don't feel I need to go into any more detail there. That should be self-explanatory. But I'll leave it up there for a second. Okay. So how can I stand out from the crowd? And this is a really, really pertinent question, because the tender process is a competitive environment, and it's all about standing out from the crowd. And whilst you're in the tender, it's very difficult to stand out from the crowd, because you have your evaluation criteria to think about, but you also have your offering, which clearly you're very proud of and you're passionate about. But there are a lot of ways of standing out from the crowd, and I've listed just 3 here because they're probably the most easy to explain in this forum. Number 1 is ask constructive clarification questions. Within every tender, you have the opportunity to ask the buying organisation questions. So if you're unsure of anything, you can ask questions. You can really use this tool to ask constructive questions, to ask questions that perhaps introduce you to them. A lot of bidders use it fairly negatively in that they really challenge the buyer organisation, but I'm definitely not a promoter of that. People still buy from people, so if you're asking questions in a polite way that are constructive, then that will go for you. Provide examples or testimonials, so where you're drawing out your benefits, your features and benefits. If you can think of any really tangible examples or testimonials, use them. If they're within the realms of the word count that you're provided, use them, because all they do is provide credibility, which again, as with point 1, will all add to your cause. And the point I've been making throughout is ensure the response is easily evaluable. So what that means is they have evaluation criteria. They have 20 responses to evaluate. Make yours the one that is easy to evaluate, easy to score, and of course, easy to score well. Okay, so that is coming, so I've kind of rushed through those slides there. I mentioned on about the 3rd or 4th slide about the engagement side of things, and for me this is a really, really critical area. Within this ebook, I do make the statement that as a public body, I never awarded a contract to a company that I didn't know, and it's a really, really important area. This ebook that you can download from the website, the Bid Better website, will give you those stages that you can go through to evaluate and how you can achieve that, and how you can obtain the management information that allows you to engage with the right people. So that's our ebook, 4 Key Steps to Winning Your Next Public Sector Bid. And there are my contact details. Please don't hesitate and give me a shout, drop me an email, or I'm on LinkedIn or Twitter or any medium you wish. But as I say, please don't hesitate. So any questions?
Thank you, Philip. So I've got a question here from Melanie. It says, how will the Carillion impact, do you think, on private sector tendering for public sector?
It's really, really unknown, and I definitely had a sense that question would come along. But the Carillion is, it is obviously a bit of a beast, and there will be a fallout from it. And I think there's been a criticism that public sector bodies are driving to the lowest cost, and that isn't always the case. So public bodies obviously have budgets to achieve, and they are driven clearly by budget restraints. The fallout from Carillion just highlights that in some ways. So Hopefully, best practice will prevail and public bodies will go back to the drawing board in terms of how they develop their evaluation criteria. And it's not necessarily about the unit cost. You know, there is the kind of the whole life cycle costing considered as well.
Wonderful, thank you. So just remember, everybody, if you've got any questions, just to put them in the question box there. Someone is asking, do you work with architects?
We don't have an architect as a client, no, but we, you know, the nature of the services we deliver is that public procurement tendering is a fairly generic process regardless of what they're buying. So yeah, we absolutely would work with an architect if it was the right project and they were bidding for public sector business and they didn't necessarily have the expertise for that tender process.
Wonderful, that was for Amos. Next, we've got a question from Rachel. She says, is it acceptable to buy a graded insurance level cover required if you win the bid, or is there still a no-no and it needs to be a place from bid entry time?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. I mentioned within the presentation there the pre-qualification process, and the pre-qualification process has been standardised in the last 18 months, 2 years, and they have an element of what's called self-certification. So if they're asking for relevant insurances and it doesn't link in with what you currently have, there is an option to say, yes, we will purchase this if awarded the contract, and that's good enough.
Okay, great. Got a couple of requests asking if you could put your contact details back up on the slide.
Yeah. Sorry if I just we got rid of them.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Another question is what's your top tip really to approach a buyer? Your number one top tip?
To approach a buyer is to identify the most suitable public body for your business. So there's a certain amount of research that you can do to see who is buying your product or service, and there's an opportunity to identify a buyer, a subject matter expert within that public organisation, and literally just make contact with them. Public procurement is all about fair and open competition. So quite frankly, if they're speaking to one supplier, they should be speaking to many suppliers.
Okay, great, thank you. Juliet says, is it a minimum requirement for selling products into the public sector that they have as a BSI, or the company has achieved a relevant ISO?
It's not, no. The question is quite well drafted, actually, in that they ask for ISO accreditations or equivalent. So if you can demonstrate a process for quality management, that is good enough.
Okay, great. I've got another question from Rachel. Do you believe that there are unlisted factors taken into consideration, such as assumed staffing levels, regardless of whether extra resources stated as being available in the bid?
Sorry, you cut out a bit there, actually, Lydia.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I can read it again. Do you believe that there are unlisted factors taken into consideration, such as assumed staffing levels, regardless of whether extra resource is stated as being available in the bid?
I don't believe, I mean, that sounds really specific, but I don't believe that there are, that they evaluate any tender on anything other than the evaluation criteria. What I do believe is that they shape that evaluation criteria before the tender. So if they want to get to an outcome, then they will develop a procurement strategy that delivers that outcome. So therefore, they might have certain higher weightings for certain elements of that evaluation criteria.
Okay, great. Thank you. Any more questions from anyone? Can't see. Let me filter through some of these quickly. Here we go. Where is the best place to find smaller public sector contracts, e.g. a portal?
Contracts Finder lists everything over £10,000, and it lists most of those under £10,000 as well. So I would say Contracts Finder.
Okay, brilliant. I think we are actually out of questions now, unless there's anybody else have any last minute. Otherwise, I'd suggest maybe getting in touch with Philip separately if maybe it's a private matter you want to take offline. His details are there. Just to mention, next week we have got how to build a more effective team with specialist Andrew Dayton. And also just to quickly mention, if anyone's looking to scale up their business, we have an event tomorrow, which is co-hosted with O2 at Twickenham Stadium to accelerate your business. There's a couple of more tickets left on there, and you can find details both for the webinar next week and for Accelerate 2018 on enterprisenation.com/events. But other than that, I think we're all done. Thank you very much, Philip.